Bragging rights. You know what they are. You love them. You want them. You enjoy it when you have them. You know what bragging rights are. They're when you win something or win something. Mainly when you win something, now that I'm thinking about it. And you get to speak in a way because you won something, because you accomplished something, because you got something. You get to speak in a way that you normally don't get to speak. You get to speak in a way that's called bragging. And we're going to come back to that later, but the moment that the phrase that I want to zero in on at the moment is the rights part of the phrase bragging rights. Because the idea of bragging rights, like the phrase itself built in, is the idea that we know that we don't usually get to speak in a certain way. Right? There's a certain way that we normally shouldn't speak or don't get to speak. Like bragging is somehow this thing that I know that I shouldn't do, or kind of in most situations it would be weird or rude for me to do. Yet certain things can come to pass that would lead me to all of a sudden be in the clear to brag, which is just so interesting, right? That there's something that would happen that would lead me to now have this mode of speech accessible to me that I didn't normally have. And the idea that happens lets us know about at least two things about the idea of bragging and what it is to brag. First of all, it's something that's kind of earned. We normally wouldn't speak that way, but then we kind of earn an ability to speak that way. But the second thing, the idea that I think is really, delicious about the idea of bragging rights is that bragging rights are things that we we want to have them. We're yeah, I want those. I want the bragging rights, And so the idea of rights around speaking in a certain way lets us know that we have this desire to speak in this particular way. We like bragging. To talk about having a right to brag, we're I want that. That is something that I would like to have. I want to be able to brag, but then also for people to look at me and be you're totally in the right to speak that way. Now, all those other people who are bragging, they're jerks, but you are right to speak this way. And even the language that we use to talk about it lets us know, it reveals to us something about our desire to partake in this particular mode of speech. Why do we like bragging? Why do we actually like it? Why does it feel good? There are lots of different ways to speak. They make us feel different things. Bragging is something where we have this weird mixed relationship. We're I know I kind of shouldn't speak that way. I know someone's going to tell me that it's bad. I know we invented this thing called the humble brag. Whatever it is. But the fact that I want the rights to it. I want the rights. Think about what it is to have the rights to something. No, that's mine. You can't use that. I've got the rights to that. Get permission. I've got rights to brag. Yes, awesome, incredible. I finally get to brag. I've always been wanting to brag. Why do we want that? Why do we like speaking that way? Why does bragging make us feel good? The Bible says that God has done something that has made this form of speech ridiculous, utterly unnecessary, no longer corresponding with reality. An old, outdated, silly way to speak. The Bible says that God has made bragging utterly useless and utterly foolish, and that God has done something such that the only people who actually have something to brag about are the people who would never reach for bragging in the first place. We're in the middle of a sermon series on the book of Romans where we're learning that there's more to life than following the rules. And last week we had a really important sermon where we looked at Romans chapter 3, verses 21 to 26, which is it's like Paul's thesis statement, out of which we're going to unpack the next however many flows of thought in the next 5 or 6 chapters. So last week's sermon it's a slog to get through. I'm going to be honest. It's long, but it's really important. And so if you didn't listen to last week's sermon, I would really encourage you to go back and listen to that and be what is Paul really saying here? Because last week, just an important sermon. And one of the main things that Paul is getting at in Romans chapter 3, 21 and 26 from last week is that for the first time ever, this has never happened before, there is a new way to get things right. Lots of background here, lots of context, just going to race through this. Righteousness, this biblical word righteousness, is really about life. It's about the life that I want or the life that I wanted. It's about some vision of the good life, and I get that when I get enough things right and I become righteous. So righteousness is about life. And in every single religion, in every single system, in every single worldview, in every single job document, in every single marriage course, in every little thing we've ever seen, it is basically said, this is the life you want, you've got to be righteous, get this stuff right to become righteous. And last week we saw that for the first time ever, God has made a new way for you to become righteous, for you to believe your way into righteousness, for you to exercise faith and as a result become righteous instead of needing to get everything right, which is a losing game. So we saw that last week, super, super important. And now Paul, just before he hinges into chapter 4, once we get into chapter 4, Paul's flow of thought is going to move on again, and we're going to follow it. But just before we get to chapter 4, Paul's finishing up this thought that he started in Romans chapter 3:21, and he's bringing it home with this weird sort of, it feels at times like a little bit of a non sequitur, like a weird addendum to chapter 3:21 to 26, where he talks about how the fact that God has made us able to be right through faith means that bragging and boasting is a totally useless, out-of-date way to speak. And he's going to round out this thought that he started in verse 21 with these 4 verses on bragging and boasting and what it means. That's what we're going to look at today. I've titled today's sermon, Stop Bragging. We are in Romans chapter 3, verses 27 to 21. If you have a Bible, you could open it up. If you have a device, you can open it up. We'll be looking at the text in a detailed fashion as we go through and open up the scripture and allow us to speak to them. I'm going to have all the text for you up on the screen because I'm increasingly a nice guy. And this includes the whole text of Romans 3, 27 to 31. So I've got it up on the screen. I'll read it aloud. Let's get into it. Then what becomes of our boasting? It is excluded. By what kind of law? By a law of works? No, but by the law of faith. For we hold that one is justified by faith apart from works of the law. Or is God the God of the Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles also? Yes, of Gentiles also, since God is one who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith. Do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. We love to brag. What is bragging? You kind of know what bragging is already. We all know what bragging is, but let's just think about it for a second. What is bragging? Romans 3:27 makes it clear that bragging and boasting is the center of what Paul's getting at in these verses. The text says, then what becomes of our boasting? Again, you saw that at the beginning of the text slide that we just saw. Implicit in Romans thus far, if we were to get into Paul's flow of thought, is the idea that Paul's arguing against that if I have the law, I've got the rule book accessible to me, I get the rules right, and both of those things make me better than other people. I'm better than other people because I have access to the rule book and they don't. I'm also better than other people because I get more right than they do. Ha! Incredible. I'm better than other people. And obviously, it would make sense that that posture would lead us to speak in a certain way that we might call boasting or bragging. What is it exactly? If we were to pull out a definition, Oxford Languages defines boasting like this: excessively proud or self-satisfied talk about one's achievements, possessions, or abilities. There are a couple things about this definition that I think are helpful. One is the language of pride, taking pride in something, an unhealthy kind of pride. I'm not going to sit here and say you can never feel good about yourself. Anytime you do, it's boasting. I think there's a weird way that we do this in religious circles sometimes, where we're like, you can't say anything good about yourself ever because we should only be saying good things about God. Well, okay, I don't have time to unpack all of that right now. That's not what I think the Bible actually teaches. Honestly, here we go. Let me just give you this little, nugget of truth. And whenever you are saying something good about yourself by way of something that God has done in you, is doing in you, has saved you, created you, then you can just sing your praises about yourself all day long. Because really what you're doing is you're saying God has done something in me. And so God's creative work in me, God's saving work in me, God's gracious work in me, God's growing work in me is something that I would then look at and go, that's good and wonderful. And when I say something good about me, it actually ultimately sort of ping-pongs back into praising God. So whenever we're talking in that way, and it's really important to have that, because then we have this dual positive cycle of verbal affirmation of God's work in me that makes me feel good about me. It's good to have a healthy sense of self and self-confidence, but none of that's coming just by way of me. It's not like an inner self-referential self-dialogue thing where I'm just like stewing in my own self-talk about me all the time. It's like God is like in and out of this cycle of dialogue where my praise is going from him and to him through me over and over and over again. You can take that home and take that to the bank and use that to have a good relationship with yourself that is coming from and to God in a really living and satisfied way. So it's not that like any pride, any kind of I feel good about this part of me is just, necessarily boasting. But the text says excessively proud or self-satisfied. Self-satisfied, talk. Two things. Excessively proud, maybe over an abundance, maybe an unhealthy view, an unrealistic view, something like that. And then the second word I think is particularly important. It's talk. Because boasting is not just something that like happens privately in my like inner dialogue. I suppose that does happen a little bit. That is part of it. But to boast, the idea of boasting is that I'm speaking publicly and in an out there way about something that I feel super good about me. So like that's pregnant in the idea of boasting, the idea that like my self-satisfied sense of myself and my pride is getting out there somehow. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about boasting. There is an external version of this, and like I said, there is an internal version. We can have like a inner dialogue that's boastful, that, and then we're like really sneaky about it. We're like, oh, I shouldn't say that out loud. Like I said in the intro, we invented the humble brag. We've got very sneaky ways of bragging because like oftentimes like we look at people who just, brag frankly, and we're like, well, you're a braggart or something. Although I don't know if anyone uses that word anymore, but it like doesn't feel good. Like if someone called me a braggart, I would be like, nobody says that anymore. And second, that feels bad to be called. I don't feel good about it. And so it's like we look at that kind of boasting and we're like, well, only someone who's really full of themselves would do that. I'm not that full of myself, but I am going to find a number of delightfully slippery ways to just, puff up my pride in a public way, even if it's like when people like I go out of my way to like appear humble or something, and so like, wow, they're so humble. Like, I am so humble, I am so incredibly humble, and it's just like all this just incredible amount of sinful self-deception. This is what bragging is. Why do we do it? Why do we brag? I'm going to give you 3 reasons for why we brag. 3 reasons for why we brag. The first reason why we brag is, well, we think we've earned it. Simple. We've earned it. I did something, and it was worthy of applause, or I won an award, or I got some coin, or I whatever it is. And as a result of that, I have earned my bragging, and so I brag because I earned it. Romans 3:27 says this: "Then what becomes of our boasting? It is excluded by what kind of law? By a law of works? No." In other words, what Paul is saying here is that a law of works does not exclude boasting. So let's just run that thought in the other idea. A law of works is like 2 thumbs up to boasting. If it doesn't exclude it, let's run it back the other way. Boasting comes from living under a law of works, because a law of works, as we've looked at in the multiple verses and chapters of Romans that we've looked at, a law of works becomes all sorts of opportunities for me to go, I read the rule book, I got it right, applause to me, incredible job me. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that living that way creates the opportunity for this kind of speech. So often we see things that are going wrong in our lives, or we see things that we wish were going differently, and we think, I'm just a bad person. I've got bad character. I should do something differently. It's not that those things aren't true necessarily, or that that's not a helpful perspective to have at times, but rarely do we zoom out enough to look at sort of the system of, living that we're in and go, how does my system of living create opportunities for sin in me? And if you are living via a logic of earning, one of the chronic opportunities that you're going to struggle with is bragging. Spoiler alert, if you were to stop living thinking that I've earned everything all the time, you're going to struggle a lot less with boastful speech because there's so much less opportunity for it to grow up in you. That's where we're going. I could stop preaching the sermon here. But I'm going to keep going because why wouldn't I? Bragging means I did it, I earned it, I got it right, I won, I like winning. And, of course, we do like winning, we do like earning, we do like getting it right, we do like being better than. And so, we really add all this up and we're like, bragging comes from something in me that just likes relating to the world in a way of earning. This is the first reason why we brag, because we like to earn stuff, and when we earn stuff, we brag. Now, quick caveat, that doesn't mean there are no standards. If you're worried that what I'm saying here is that there's no standards at all and we shouldn't ever think about, wouldn't it be great to earn that thing or work hard towards that thing, that's not what I'm saying. Paul actually goes out of his way to address this in Romans 3:31 when he says, do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. Paul doesn't explain why here, although he's explained it a little bit in the verses that came before, if you remember from previous sermons. We're going to come back to this stuff about the law in a couple chapters. But it's just interesting here that at the end of this flow of thought, Paul's like, hey, by the way, remember those of you who have accused me of just throwing away the rules? Remember those of you who have accused me of just saying, the rules are terrible, don't listen to them ever, we're doing a totally new thing? Remember those of you who have accused me of saying God's law is awful, he shouldn't have ever given it in the first place, he's throwing it away? I'm just going to remind all of you that I'm not doing that. I'm upholding this thing. We're relating to it in an entirely different way, but I'm upholding this thing called the law. So it doesn't mean there are no standards. It doesn't mean we don't relate to them. And if this is the only sermon in this sermon series that you've heard, you need to hear me say that. That's why Paul drops this little line in here and then doesn't explain it and move on. But verse 31 is like a weird verse. Is it like attached to what just came before, or is it like the first verse of 4, 1-8? It kind of is a strange little throw-in. I'm interpreting it as like a concluding thought where he just goes, hey, remember those of you who have accused me of being antinomian? I'm not antinomian. If you don't know what antinomian is, it's my fault for not explaining it to you. All right, reason number two, why we brag. 1, we earn things. 2, we think we're better than other people. Right? Reason 1, we think we earned it. Reason 2, we think we're better than. Second reason why we brag. Romans 3:28, for we hold that one is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. Again, we're going to run this in the other direction to see what people were saying. Paul says that this is a reason why boasting is excluded, that we hold that one is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. In other words, boasting should be excluded because of the way that someone comes to being righteous, the way that someone comes to be righteous, the way that someone comes to be a person who got it right, who has something to brag about. Paul's saying we hold that everybody's on the same playing field of not earning it and of getting there by the mechanism of faith. That's what we teach. But for people who don't teach that, it creates this hierarchy, stratified, what plateau are you on the mountain type thing, where different people did or didn't get certain things based on what they did. And that whole hierarchical way of viewing the world and accomplishment becomes an opportunity for me to go, I'm just better than that person. I just am cooler than them. I won more than them. I accomplished more than them. I work harder more than them. And do you see this is important? Do you see how this is different than just the earning thing? Because the earning thing is like just a relationship between what's going on inside of me and that external thing that I won at. That's the earning. But the better than, the bragging because of, like, I'm better than other people, now I'm not just bragging because I earned something or won at something. I'm bragging specifically because I like the fact that I'm better than that other person over there. Right? That's a different source of bragging. One is, I won, brag. The other is, I'm better than you, and now I'm going to brag. These are two different things that lead to the same end point, but it is important to recognize that we get there in this situation by two different roads. And the reality is that we just frankly like thinking that we're better than other people. We just do. Don't pretend that you don't. I know some of you are like, I don't like that at all. I believe in just total equality of everybody. I know we all sort of do believe in that, but like you like thinking that you're better than other people. We go into, let's just think about this. You want to be successful. Think of something right now that you want to be successful in. Think of it. You want to be successful. Get serious and simple about that word success, and then go, where's that live in me? Okay, you got it? It's in your mind? Built into the idea of success and what it would feel like for you to feel like that you are a success. Built into that whole thing is the idea that I won and somebody else didn't. Because not everyone can be a success. Otherwise, success wouldn't exist in the way that we think about it. In order for that whole construct to exist, some people have to be not a success. Bummer for them. What a drag. They can hopefully go to therapy and have someone help, work them through that. But me, I'm going to be a success, and I'm going to feel good about it. And that whole superstructure exists in a very worldly way of engaging with other people where we just go, I just really like being better than other people. I like it that I won and they didn't. And we are just so often rushing to that, not thinking about all the bodies that have to be, just strewn apart in our wake behind us in order for us to have gotten to the place where I finally get to feel good about my win. Because in order for there to be winners, there has to be losers. Thank God that we're not those people. Thank God. And so we get to brag. And that is where bragging by way of being better than other people comes from. It's built into all of us in this time, unless there somehow are truly people here who are like, success means nothing to me. And even then, there's probably something else for you. But don't lie, you're in Manhattan, you're here for success, you care about it, don't pretend that you don't, you do. And as a result of that, there's something in our boasting and our bragging that's related to being better than other people. First reason that we brag, we think we earned it. Second reason we think we brag, we think we're better than other people. Third reason that we brag, we hate God. That's the third reason that we brag. That's maybe a punchy way to say that. You could say we don't love God, but I'm just really going to get you today. So we hate God. You hate God. And that's the third reason that you brag. Paul says, again, in Romans 3:27, he says, then what becomes of our boasting? It's excluded by what kind of law? By law of works? No, but by the law of faith. That word then is important. We also could render it as therefore. The Greek word for therefore is in this passage. What it basically means is that Paul's saying, I just told you a bunch of stuff that God did, and now we're going to apply it to what it means for our boasting. And he's going to say it's excluded. So again, let's run that thought back the other way. If I like boasting, if God did a bunch of stuff to make boasting a silly, ridiculous, anachronistic way of speaking, and yet I love it, what's the implication of that running back the other way? Well, I don't really like what God did. I don't. If God did something that eliminates boasting, and I like boasting, and I'm like really camping out in it, I must not like the thing or the person who did the thing to get rid of it. And that is you and me. We just really don't like God, and we don't like his actions. We don't like what he did. I know we talk about liking God. We talk about how we like the stuff that he does. We talk about how good and kind he is and all that sort of stuff. But really, deep down, at the end of the day, there is something going on in our nature that the Scripture says is just in rebellion against God. It just doesn't like him, and it doesn't like what God does. And so no matter what we talk or when we say the right answers in our groups and in our church stuff, deep down, there's a part of our nature that is living a lie that God is this big, angry meanie who's out to ruin my life. And as a result of that, we just don't like him. And so we like doing things and acting in ways and speaking in ways that are in themselves denials of who God is and what God has done. And boasting and bragging is a denial of what God has done. Because God has done something incredible through his son, Jesus Christ. He has created a way for you to get it right, for you to be righteous, for you to have a life, the life that you want, the life that you were created to have by means of faith. And the fact that God has done that should make all of us go, oh, obviously we're all done bragging. Obviously we're done bragging. It doesn't compute to keep speaking this way. The only reason we would is if I'm living in an essential denial or hatred of the stuff that God has done to make boasting and bragging anachronistic. We don't like God. We don't like what he's done. We really love the way of the world. We love how I feel when I feel like I earned something. We love how I feel when I feel like I won at something. We love how I feel when I feel like I was a success and that other person's struggling with not feeling that way, but thank God that's not me. That's the way of the world. And when we boast, what we basically are saying is, I just really like the way the world works, frankly. And this thing that God has done to fundamentally change the nature of reality such that everyone's on an equal playing field and no one has earned anything ever again, I just don't like it. I don't want to live in that world. And so I don't. And so my mouth doesn't. So my tongue doesn't. You know, we live in a world where there are all kinds of parables in the physical world about the spiritual world, right? There are different countries and different cultural groups that speak different languages, right? And literally the physical pieces, parts of those languages and the sounds and linguistic natures of them are different, right? That's a parable of spiritual languages that exist in different places. Let me suggest to you that like lying, for example, is like the official language of hell. I'm not saying anything here about hell in this moment. You know, you have your own thoughts about it for the time being. You can ask me questions later. I'm saying there's a place of spiritual death, and it's got an official language. Like if you were to get like a passport there, it would be like official language, falsehood and deceit. That's a language that exists in that place. It comes from that place. It's authored by the ruler of that place. Bragging and boasting is authored by the world. It's authored by this place. It's an official language of this place. It's a way of speaking that fits in this realm and time where humans are pitted against one another and we're just climbing over top of one another to win and feel good. There are many things we could say are sort of the official language of heaven, but let's just compare like the language of praise to the language of lie and boasting. Praise is like an official language of heaven. It's like a spiritual way of speaking that exists in heaven. And so you are sort of asking the question right now as you're pursuing faith in Jesus, or maybe just asking questions about faith in God generally, what does my speech say about where I like to live? Like, what does my speech say? Is heaven like a vacation destination, but really I just can't wait to get back to the rest of my life where I just get to go on boasting? Because our speech tells us like what my home country is. My speech tells me where I like want to make up my residence. I mean, that's just what it says. And so you need to ask yourself and look in yourself, what does my speech say about where I'm living? And about like where, just what ground am I standing on? What soil am I standing on? Where is it? Because your speech, just like anyone else who opens their mouth and starts speaking in their mother tongue, your speech says, this is where my home is, and this is where I like to live, and this is the way of life that I like to live. The reality is that God has done something in Jesus Christ where nobody has any reason to brag anymore. It just doesn't fit. It's not that you're bad for bragging. You are. I am. But there's a deeper thing. It doesn't make any sense anymore. If you were to live all the way in the new reality that God has inaugurated through the work of His Son, Jesus Christ, you would go, bragging, it's like speaking a language that is not the official language of a foreign country that I'm traveling in. It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit this time and this reality anymore. This is what Romans 3:30 says. God is one who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith. This text is saying, if you've got questions about circumcision and all this sort of stuff, we've deep dived this in a couple different passages. This ritual rite of marking someone's flesh in a particular way to delineate them as the people of God is used in Romans to talk about the major marker between Jew and Gentile. So what is Paul really saying here? He's saying God has justified everyone by the same mechanism. Everyone. And it's a mechanism that excludes earning. And because it's a mechanism that is for all people, it excludes anyone getting to feel like they're better than anybody else. Because that's where bragging comes from. Feeling like I earned it or I'm better than you. This, what God has done, it has made it such that no one has any reason to feel like I earned it or any reason to feel like I'm better than anybody else. And so God has done something that makes bragging totally just old and ridiculous and out of date and not fitting anymore. And every time we find ourselves having boastful or bragging speech or in myself longing for that day when I can finally boast in that win, boast in that achievement, boast at not feeling like I haven't been a success or whatever it is, what we're saying is I'm longing for the old order of things. I'm longing for the old ways of the world. I really don't like heaven all that much. I've been up there. I don't like how they talk. I like how we talk down here. And that's what we're saying when we do this, because God has done something in Jesus that makes boasting and bragging totally out of date. And really, let's just bring this all the way home to your experience of what God has done in Jesus. I mean, how could anyone brag about anything anymore if that person is saying, I was saved? I mean, how could someone who honestly confesses, I've been saved, brag or boast about anything? I mean, to be saved is to have been in a place of just total, destitute, overwhelmed lostness. Like, no hope for you. For those of us who say, I've been saved by something that Jesus has done. I mean, if that were like really something that we had taken all the way in, like bragging would just be done. It doesn't make sense to speak that way anymore if I'm also saying I've been saved by Jesus. Paul writes about this. Paul gets into these debates with people around the ancient world where they're bragging about qualifications and who's authoritative. And a number of times in these conversations, Paul is like, I actually have a lot of fleshly, worldly markers that would lead me to have quite a bit to brag about. But I know it's ridiculous to do that because of what God has done in the cross of Jesus Christ, right? This is what he says in Galatians 6:14. He says, but far be it from me, far be it, far away, distance, far be it from me to boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by which the world has been crucified to me and I to the world. You know, there's something that happens when we play the bragging game, where we get into the conversations at times where like different people are bragging and they're bragging about different things. And there's an essential instability to that kind of conversation, because the thing about bragging is that your bragging can be shamed the minute that someone who has a categorically better reason to brag shows up and brags. Right? Like your speech just gets totally ripped out. It's a handful of people being like, hey, I had this one at work. I had this one, and this one. And then someone else comes on along and is like, hey, I'm a doctor and I saved somebody's life yesterday. It's like, awesome. Now we feel like total crap, And it's like that way of speech has an essential weakness to it like that. Jesus has done something. God's Son has done something that, even though Jesus is very humble and not a braggart, what he's done has like pulled the rug out from under everybody's braggy conversation. Because like, who could ever brag again once they've seen what God's Son did? It's just embarrassing. It's honestly embarrassing to be like, oh my gosh, I'm feeling so good about this. When it's like, okay, let's just think about what God's Son did. So God's Son is God's Son. He lived in heaven, and he was having a great time in heaven. And then he like became incarnate. So let's just stop right there. Like God becoming a human. A total translation of a divine nature into a human nature. We could like, Jesus would show up and be like, hey, I know what it's like to be divine and human right there. So like, stop telling me about like all the great like worldly travel that you did. Like I know you're getting a real thrill out of it, but like you're walking back in like, oh, I went to this new place. I feel so incredible. He's like, have you ever traversed like from heaven to earth? Because it's a really like challenging journey, and like I was no big deal for me. And it's like, okay, cool. So I'm not going to talk about like where Delta took me like anymore, because it's just, and Jesus is doing that to us over and over and over and over again. He's humble and kind, so he's very rarely like, hey, let me brag at you. But like the stuff he did, moving from heaven to earth, doing works of power, doing miracles, multiplying food, multiplying wine, healing people, doing all of that from a place of total distance. Who wants to brag about how hard their life is? Jesus could brag about how hard his life is. Who wants to brag about their power? Jesus could brag about their power. And Jesus has all of those things, and they don't even begin to touch how much Jesus should be able to brag about dying for everybody, a sacrificial death on the cross, dying for everyone, and then getting back up from the ground. No one has any reason to brag anymore, because all of our bragging just becomes ridiculous and stupid and silly once we remember that the world has seen what Jesus of Nazareth did, and it has silenced all boasting. It's just totally shut its mouth. This is what has happened in the death and resurrection of Jesus. Now listen, if you were to let some of these things get all the way into your life, we might speak and think differently in relationship to other people and other relationship situations that we're in. So let's just think for a second about challenges, chronic fights that we have in our marriages, or maybe a roommate situation, a longtime friend. Boasting is the expression, the verbal expression of the inner postures that I have, that I earned it, I got this thing right, and I'm better than you. If those inner postures were to change as a result of the gospel, of looking at this and going, bragging is dead. It doesn't exist. Every time I brag, every time I boast in that way, I'm speaking a dead languages, right? Like Latin. Boasting is a dead language. Every time I bring that back up in my marriage or in this fight with this roommate or whatever it is, I'm speaking a dead language. I'm not allowing the gospel to get all the way in. I'm not seeing all the reasons that Jesus had to boast. But if those things were to change, I would show up without that spirit of pride and self-centeredness and a holier-than-thou nature to these conflicts over and over again. And we would actually maybe begin to have conversations with people in a way that is fundamentally different. We do this in the political realm too. In our politics, we look at different groups of people and we go, oh my gosh, I'm better than you. I got more things right. There's one particular way that this impacts a way that we often think about things politically. I want to just apply this to the way we might think about immigration for a second. Because, with our politics, we get all weird about politics in church and think about politics and be like, oh my God, we're talking about politics and what do you think? And, everyone should have. I've said this before, but we live in a democracy. And so to pretend that you don't have some sort of political agency is just to not live in the reality of the time that we live in. So you should stand up in your politics and in your beliefs and all that sort of stuff. And wherever you are in that, you should be longing for the gospel to come in and fill that place up such that you are where you are in your politics in a way that has been changed and transformed and grown into a gospel version of that location. Now, sometimes that happens in a way where you may have to do a little sliding. Yeah, you can figure that out with Jesus. But more than trying to slide one way or another on the political spectrum, what you're looking for is to grow into a gospel-shaped version of the convictions that I have and the way that I see the world. Let's think about this with respect to immigration for a second, the way that boasting complicates this. So often when people view immigrants negatively, there's a sense of like, those people over there are not getting things right. Those people over there, those countries over there, they're disordered, they're whatever it is. If they could just govern themselves better, if they could just, and they just need to figure things out. They just need to be better at what they're doing. And now they're coming here and they're bringing them all these problems, all these sorts of things. Now, look, we have most of the people in this room who probably think about that way of viewing immigrants. We're like, yeah, I hate that perspective, right? That's fine. That's probably just what the political makeup of a room like this is in Manhattan. But I'm trying to get you to see like the way that like bragging and boastful undercurrents, like we are better than, is underneath that perspective, right? What if we just like applied the gospel to that for a second? What if we just like lived in the gospel picture of myself as being an immigrant, lost and detached from my home, trying to find my way home to heaven, right? Like none of us would ever get in. If God viewed us with the same way that sort of harsh perspective towards immigrants, right? If God viewed us that way, none of us would ever get in. We would never get in. Not the person not the most ideal model, soon-to-be citizen who's getting everything right, who's doing all the tests, who's doing all the paperwork. None of us would ever get into heaven if God treated us that way, right? Now, when you apply this onto a political perspective, you can imagine God as either throwing the doors of heaven wide open, right? And so you maybe think about that in terms of your political thing about immigration. You could think about it as still in the sense that like heaven has these high walls because of God's holiness. It's hard to get into, but God has made a way for us to get through that, and He loves making a way for us to get through that. It doesn't matter which way you think about that. The posture here is recognizing the way that boasting and bragging gets into our perception of this particular issue and the way we view other people, and that if we were to just stop for a second and say, what does the gospel have to say to me about that? It would completely change and transform the way that I think about it, because none of us would ever get in if God treated us as immigrants in that way. Wherever you are in terms of how you think about immigration policy or whatever, and exactly how it should be manifested, all Christians should be shaped by this kind of gospel reflection. That we need to have the same perspective towards other people that God has towards us, because God wants us to get in. He wants us to get in. Thank God that God wants us to get in. If that weren't true, we would all be lost and knocking on the door. But God doesn't treat us that way. In that same way, our boasting and bragging should be removed when we think about any number of different political issues, as we let the gospel fill them up and change and shape the way that we think about this. This sort of heads into our concluding point here. Look, boasting is a dead language. Don't do it. But really, at the end of the day, what this text says in terms of like the payoff of being done boasting is it's like I get to be reconciled with other people. I get to be made one with other people. Like when I've got my speech shaped in this way, my speech and the internal character stuff, they're in like a mutually reciprocal relationship where they're just actually creating me into someone that's not able to be made one with somebody else or with another group of people. This is what Paul says in Romans 3:29. Or is God the God of Jews only? Is He not the God of the Gentiles also? Yes, of the Gentiles also. There's a fascinating connection here. Amen. Indeed. There's a fascinating connection here that Paul, it's counterintuitive at first. Basically what Paul is saying is this. He's saying either God is one and all people are one, or God is many and all people are divided. And boasting corresponds, or not boasting corresponds to one of those two categories. Not boasting, I know, just stack it all up here in your mind, stack it all up. Not boasting, when I'm done boasting, that means that I believe that God is one and that all people are one. When I am boasting, what I'm implicitly saying is that God is many. I've got my God, you've got your God, my God's a little bit better, and my God likes me better, and also we are divided. That way of speech stacks on to those other two beliefs. That's what Paul's saying in this passage. Yeah, you've added it up in your head now, and you're like, that's wild to bring those things together. That's what it is. I speak in a certain way that says something about God and says something about people, right? That's what's at stake here. When we become done boasting, what we're really saying is that God is one, God is the God of all people, and all people really are one, and God has reconciled us and made us one together. You should be done bragging because you want to be one with other people. You're not one with your spouse, you're not one with your friends, you're not one with your coworkers, you're not one with people from other cultures, you're not one from people with other beliefs, all this sort of stuff. You're not one with other people, and it's tied up in the facts that you brag and boast. Now, it's maybe because of the bragging and boasting at times, maybe the bragging and boasting is a symptom of something deeper. Whatever it is, it kind of doesn't matter. It's just the facts that we are not reconciled to one another, and it matches with this particular pattern of speech. Paul here is saying that the fact that God has done something to make boasting a dead language means at the same time that we can finally be one with other people, which means when you think about hard conversations with other people, when you think about wanting to be reconciled, you should go, if I'm going to show up here either explicitly boasting or from a place of boasting, I pretty much guaranteed that there's going to be no reconciliation in this conversation. There's going to be no reconciliation between me and this other person. There's going to be no reconciliation of this conflict. But when we're able to show up to those people and show up to those conflicts from a place of saying, boasting's dead, there's no reason for anybody to boast, with that essential pattern of speech removed, now the door is open for what is true to be on display in your relationship, in your interaction with that person, in your solving of that conflict, that we are essentially one. That is what is revealed by the fact that boasting has been put to death in Jesus Christ, the ability that we can now be reconciled to other people. We should stop bragging. It would be great if we could do that. If you can't, if you're just like, I'm just not going to be able to be done bragging and boasting, the last thing that I have to say to you today is that if that's really where you are, the other great biblical witness about this is that you can hold on to the bragging pattern of speech and just apply it to something else. You could just resolve to just brag about God. You could do that. And actually, that is biblical counsel given by Paul to the churches. So if you're just like, I love boasting, it is just something I love to do, frankly, well, good news. You could boast about God instead, because God has done any number of things, not just in this text, outside of this text, that are just so worthy of your boasting. When I'm boasting about my own earning, I could boast instead about all the things that God has earned. When I'm boasting about the things that, ways that I feel better than other people, I could boast about the way that Jesus is utterly high and exalted and yet wants everybody to be raised up to his level as we're transformed into increasing likenesses of God's glory. You could look at God and say, there is something worth being boasted about, and it's God, and it's the work that God has done in Jesus Christ. And if we were to do that, if we were either to stop boasting and say, let's have this pattern of speech be put to death in me, or if we were to take on a boasting and a bragging about God, we would bring something different to the world. We would bring a pattern of speech that is befitting of heaven to the world, and we would be people who are able to experience greater degrees of reconciliation in our life with other people as we stop showing up as braggarts to our lives and our conversations. Amen.